Let me start by just showing you our book cover and saying a bit about it. You've probably all seen this also on the poster. Um, you might not have noticed what this is. This is a reproduction of a photograph by Michael Downing that's called Plastic Vanitas. This is a typical still life of an abundant table, except that it isn't. Everything on this table, even the tablecloth, is plastic. There are none of the signs of spoilage that typify early modern memento mori paintings. In fact, nothing here is edible. Downing is playing with the ubiquity of plastic in our domestic environments and also with the worries about plastic contaminants in food. And just an example of that would be BPA in packaging, which has been analyzed really well by Sarah Vogel, who contributed to our book. This paradox of plenty and worry around food is at the heart of Risk on the Table. Technologies that were invented to increase agricultural productivity and to solve the food security problem have become themselves the source of new and difficult to quantify risks, not to mention the questionable nutritional value of many of the highly processed foods that an industrialized food system have made available. So standing behind the example of plastic residues in food are many other scandals and regulatory crises, from salmonella poisoning to PCBs in fish, which is an issue in France and which Aurélien Ferron discusses in our book. So why, after a century of technological progress and regulatory oversight, does the safety of industrialized food appear so elusive? And Risk on the Table is really a book that tries to understand the history between the ongoing heartburn of food worries. Just one word about how this book came about. My previous book looked at the history of radioisotopes and how their production and use was linked to the atomic age. And one of the things that I became aware of was that radioactive fallout from nuclear weapons testing in the 50s especially was getting radioactivity into food. And that really put this issue on the table for me. This is something that Soraya Chatterivian explores really well in our book. And in addition, I was also thinking about how environmental contaminants are understood, and radioactivity actually provided a really important template, both scientifically and in terms of regulatory features for chemical contaminants. And much of this book really looks at the role of food chemicals. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jean-Paul Gaudillière to pick up our presentation.
So, as Angela mentioned, I'm an historian of science and medicine, not of agriculture. So, Risk on the Table was a kind of unexpected target for a new collaboration with Angela after several others. And it originates in a kind of gray zone between the two big projects I conducted in the 2010s. Namely, the first was a series of investigation on the history of 20th century pharmacy and its industrialization, looking at the rise of in-house industrial research, the development of scientific marketing, and the mounting importance of state regulation through statistical trial. And there is actually a trace of that in the chapter I wrote for the book. And the second big project was an exploration of health government at the international level, gathering a group of historians and anthropologists to better understand global health, its origin and practices. So it is in this space in between, in this gray zone, that Nathalie Jass and myself decided to conduct a 2 years project on the appropriation of the endocrine disruptors paradigm in France and on the ways in which this appropriation and the investigation of nonlinear dose effect changed toxicology. And this was what brought me more closely to get interested in issues of food dangers and risks. So now I would like to start our discussion by saying a few words about Risk on the Table and the industrialization of food. I mean, although the dynamics of industrialization is not directly the target of analysis of the book, it is very much central to it and a kind of ghost haunting the book. Industrial in this context means at the same time mass production, mechanization of work, processing, standardized products, and mass consumption. And the mechanization of farms began in the late 19th century, but it's only by the mid-century that gastric revolution of new agrochemicals started and was underway. So that in the early 1950s, we had only 50 synthetic pesticides available in the United States, but 10 years later, the number was 500. So the systematic use of chemicals as fertilizers, growth enhancers, preservatives, additives, therapeutics, or packaging material are actually at the heart of the book. And of course, Risk on the Table could have focused on other issues, for instance, on the very prominent discussion regarding the ways in which processed, salty, and sugary food has contributed to the rise of diabetes and obesity worldwide. But the contamination and the risk associated with chemicals have actually, and this is probably the main reason for our choice, have actually polarized the majority of debates, public as well as in the social sciences, regarding agrobusiness, a term actually coined in 1955. And not only agrobusiness, but also the problems with its regulation. So one may say that food production is an apt example of Ulrich Beck's risk society hypothesis, according to which science and technology and their industrial uses generate new risks, including boomerang effects that endanger entire populations. So while bacteriological and pasteurization technique, along with refrigeration, did enable relatively safe mass production and large-scale transportation of perishable food, the industrialization of agriculture, with its containment methods for livestock production and heavy dependence on pesticides and plastic packaging, generated new problems, including soil exhaustion, insect extinction, or antibiotic resistance. Documenting these new risks, their origin, and the attempt to control them, the authors of Risk on the Table highlight the close relationship between food and drugs, agriculture and medicine, that maintain with the same hegemonic actors involved. So, and these parallels between pharmacy and agrobusiness should not overshadow the fact that ways of regulating have, however, remained very different, with, in the case of food, a remarkable absence of pre-marketing assessment of the nutritional value or of the utility of products more generally. Angela, we have the next slide? Yes. So the book also explores aspects of industrialization that have only recently gained traction among historians and social scientists, namely the adverse consequences of scaling up on the one hand and of post-colonial globalization on the other hand. And I will finish with 2 words about that. Sadly, the conundrum of scalability is perfectly exemplified by the trajectory of antimicrobial resistance. The massive use of antibiotics has been a precondition for the scaling up of industrial husbandry, both as growth promoters and as treatments against infection in farms. Antimicrobial resistance has therefore been there from the start, and its magnitude and seriousness have grown in direct proportion with the scale of uses. And as Klaus Kirchell tells us, regulation has proved intractable apart from some control of medical practices. And finally, I'd like to say that Risk on the Table are obviously not the province of the wealthy countries of the global north, as Lucas Müller shows with his account of the differentiated ways the dangers of aflatoxin were dealt with in Europe and Africa. The book, thus, we think, helps recognize the dark side of the post-colonial Green Revolution and the ways in which the industrialization of food has contributed to the Anthropocene. And you may keep that in mind for the general discussion.
And I'll just say one more word. Another issue that the book really tries to address is contemporary concerns about science and regulation, showing how the food industry often uses regulatory procedures and tools, things like toxicology testing, dose response modeling, or risk assessment, to reach preferred outcomes in regulatory decision-making. And scholars who work in this area, and it's been an area of a lot of activity, I'd say, including in Paris right now, often talk about the production of ignorance or undone science, or how industrial actors emphasize scientific uncertainty, even if consensus exists, to move public opinion and regulatory processes in particular directions. And one of the things that Jean-Paul and I have reflected on is that since we first began working on this project 7 years ago, or 8 years ago now, I think there has been something of a shift in the real world realities about food regulation and regulation more generally. The case studies that our book looks at, everybody is playing the regulatory game. This is regulation by certain kinds of technological and technocratic procedures. But certainly in the second Trump administration, we see the possibility of abandoning technocracy as a mode of regulating to just regulation by fiat. So I don't know whether that will occur or not, but given the strong emphasis on regulation in the book, we're definitely capturing a certain moment in time, which may or may not be challenged at this point. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Hannah Landecker, who is a contributor to the book and is going to say a little bit about her own contribution. She's in the Department of Sociology and the Institute for Society and Genetics at UCLA, where she also directs the Center for Reproductive Science, Health, and Education. And she is well known for her work on metabolism. And as we see, her chapter concerns arsenical drugs used as growth promoters in agriculture. Hannah?
Thank you very much. I'm going to share my slides. So thanks so much for this opportunity to speak about this chapter. I absolutely agree that for many of us who published things in the depths of 2020, it feels a little bit like that work disappeared. And it's really great to have the opportunity to bring it back into view. And I do agree also that it is only getting more timely. So I'm going to use my 10 minutes to provide a small arsenic-laced appetizer for this evening's proceedings and talk about the chapter that I contributed to the book. So the first thing to say about this chapter is that it fits into, I think, the broader thematic that runs throughout the book that Angela just pointed to, and that is the very careful historicization of the regulatory systems around food risk. Now, in your mind, the pairing of arsenic and food in the same sentence might make your thoughts jump to associations such as accident or poisoning. And so you might expect that this is the story of a regulatory failure or a regulatory shortfall in failing to protect consumers against accidental poisoning. So this very pairing of arsenic and food might lead you to think that this chapter is the story of an accident. But actually, the history of arsenical drugs being used as growth promoters in the food system, and this is a story that is based in the United States, but these arsenical growth promoters are used around the world, perhaps not so much in Europe, where they wisely decided that it wasn't such a good idea to put arsenic in the food system, but arsenical growth promoters are and were widely used in many countries around the world. And what I think is significant about them is that they are systems of chemical dosing that were designed really due to their organization around food production to get into the maximum number of bodies. And this is why the chapter is called Trace Amounts at Industrial Scale. It was really the intentional engineering and regulatory facilitation of the mass ubiquitous distribution of small amounts of potent chemicals into the bodies of food animals that were at the crux of this historical story. So arsenic-based growth promoters were something I stumbled across as a topic by accident. I was looking into the topic of the use of antibiotics in agriculture. It's much more widely known that antibiotics were used as a growth promoter. And much to my surprise, I found that these arsenical drugs really predated the use of antibiotics in agriculture by some years. So drugs such as this one that you see on the screen, Renosol, which is an organic arsenic-based substance which came under the trade name of roxarsone, was approved by the FDA for use in animal feed in 1944. And such things were in fairly continuous and ubiquitous use until 2015 in the United States. So the chapter uses archival and documentary analysis to answer two central questions about something like an arsenical growth promoter and its role not just in the industrialization of agriculture, but really the industrialization of metabolism. So the first question I wanted to answer with the research was, how did arsenical drugs become a standard component in the feed of animals grown as human food? And second, how on earth did it ever seem to be a good idea to add arsenic to the human food supply? Much less, how is it that it was regarded for so long as being without consequence for human health? So the first question, why arsenic? Well, this speaks to what Jean-Paul was saying, that he's a historian of medicine and a historian of health and not a historian of agriculture. But in this story, actually, the things themselves are crossing between those domains. So it was discovered in the early 20th century that the arsenic element bonded to carbon was much less toxic than inorganic arsenic, and derivatives of this chemical formulation, arsphenamine, became the first magic bullets in the treatment of syphilis. The story of Paul Ehrlich and Zaharia Hatta developing salvarsan and then neosalvarsan is very well known. These were the first drugs to be effective against syphilis. Now, in the early 1940s, when there were enormous outbreaks of intestinal parasitical diseases in the growing flocks of industrializing poultry production, scientists working on this problem of intestinal parasites thought about Ehrlich's work and set to work testing arsenical drugs as antiparasiticals. They discovered by accident that they were also growth promoting in small proportions. And in 1944, as I said, roxarsone was approved by the FDA for weight gain, feed efficiency, which means that it actually changed the ratio between the amount of food that went in and the amount of growth that came out. And this curious other characteristic of improved pigmentation, that is that the arsenic drugs made the meat pinker and therefore more attractive to consumers. Now, of course, people don't just use things because they're effective. They also use them because they're very cheap. And as we could tell a much larger story of the industrialization of agriculture and metabolism and its connection to other domains, agriculture becomes a repository for waste from other industries. So unprocessed copper ore in the United States generally contained between 3 and 11% arsenic, and the copper smelting business was supplemented with byproduct recovery, such as the smelter that you see on the screen here, located in the tide flats adjacent to Tacoma, Washington. neighbors downwind had complained that the smoke was killing their plants and their livestock, and so they built a recovery apparatus for the arsenic trioxide. Next to this smelter sprung up a production facility for pesticides. And these high volumes of cheap arsenic trioxide then fed forward into the business of specific toxicity, both in terms of human medicines and pesticides. In 1912, calcium and lead arsenate pesticides were marketed for control of codling moth in northwest apple crops and boll weevil in southern cotton crops. By 1944, 86 million pounds of lead arsenate and 42 million pounds of calcium arsenate were applied to crops annually for insect control. So I just want to give you an indication here that arsenic was being used in agriculture in animal feed, but it was cheap and systemically available because there was this practice of widespread specific toxicity being practiced with arsenic. By 1952, industry analysts estimated that 80% of U.S. broiler chickens and an even higher percentage of laying hens were being raised on arsenical supplemented feed. Turkeys followed close afterwards. And this is a picture that's in the article, and it is of the production facilities in Iowa of Dr. Salisbury's. And they initiated the use of roxarsone, which was then sold to Pfizer. And Pfizer was the company that produced it en masse over the 20th century. So that tells us why arsenical medicines came to be used in food production, but it doesn't really answer the second question, which is why it seemed for so long that this use of arsenic in animal feed, a manifestly toxic substance, was of no risk to human health. Now, the short answer is that the regulatory apparatus relied solely, and I mean 100%, on studies provided by the feed industry itself. Because arsenic in low doses is not directly carcinogenic, and because organic arsenicals are indeed much less poisonous than inorganic arsenic, these small short-term studies focused on trace amounts really framed their own definitions of safety and then met it by not looking at cumulative effects or long-term effects or taking any consideration of the environment. At the same time, it was assumed that public health risk from trace arsenic actually came from drinking water in areas with high natural arsenic content in the surrounding geology. That is, it was assumed to be a natural geological risk. So standards were set for drinking water, but food remained unregulated and untested because it was assumed that such standards or tests weren't needed. And we can also say that there was this optimism, right, about the productive and positive effects in general of the use of chemistry to increase agricultural production. So the text of this ad says Malthus was wrong. Malthus predicted the world population would outgrow its food supply, but he didn't include the agricultural and food chemist in his calculations. He never dreamed that technologists could make wasteland fertile, multiply acreage yields, cut down plant disease and pest damage, produce meatier livestock, grow crops without soil, and supplement diets with synthetic vitamins. So this ad from the 1950s really shows you the assumption of positive outcome for these things. So it wasn't until the 2010s that the FDA, under pressure from scientists and consumer advocacy groups, began to redo some of the studies that really hadn't been revisited since the 50s or the 60s. And not only were chicken and turkey products shown to contain arsenic at much higher levels than anticipated, rice grown in agricultural areas that had a history of poultry farming or arsenate spraying of cotton or citrus, even if it was now being farmed by organic methods, carried this legacy into many snacks or sweeteners, brown rice syrup, brown rice sweeteners, And cereals made increasingly popular actually by the health turn to away from sugar and away and the rise in popularity of gluten-free foods. So perhaps reading the writing on the wall, the sale of roxarsane and other arsenicals were voluntarily suspended in the United States. But I will underline that the companies did not stop making these products, and they are still being widely used around the world. So just to conclude, the final thing that I want to say about this story is that the science of low-dose arsenic exposure is not just a given risk that we already know how to recognize, but raises the historical question of how risks themselves are changing over time. And this is another thing that I think the book really does. It historicizes what kind of risk on whose table is happening at any given time. And so what I see in the contemporary studies, for example, of the associations between long-term chronic exposure to very low-dose arsenic and chronic conditions such as diabetes, is a very different kind of risk here. So we might note the rise of diet-linked pathology, not as a direct insult, but as a kind of wearing down of the mechanisms of cellular and bodily resilience and repair, such that disease emerges as a kind of failure of maintenance instead of a direct breakage. So if arsenic reduces the thickness of the mucosal layer of the gut and the diversity of commensal microbes living there, then the body's ability to buffer exposure to arsenic via the intermediating metabolism of its microbes is much reduced. So it's a reduction of resilience or capacity to buffer. And finally, arsenic that might have come into the environment via animal feed comes to bodies that are already changed by that very food environment of cheap meat and fat, made possible by these growth promoters, such that the current condition can't be reduced to arsenic and its risks or any one other element or any other one pollutant. But this is a kind of risk that occurs in systems of interactions in which a whole set of factors are hung together. So this is an image by Amisha Gadani, an artist who works with us in the Institute for Society and Genetics, just depicting this kind of notion of systemic risk, where we see the human gut, or it could be any gut, but it's the human gut in the middle there, surrounded by this historical circle of circumstance. Okay, so I will stop there and see if there are any questions.
Thank you very much. We do have a few moments for questions, so please feel free to either raise your hand. Oh, yes, Jean-Paul, you're first.
Yes, thank you so much. And just would like you to expand a little bit about what you said about the industrialization of metabolism. And whether for you industrialization of metabolism means chiefly or mostly what you alluded to at the end of your talk with the case of arsenical, which is the consequences of industrial production of some of these elements which impact the metabolism. So arsenical is there, and it is changing our metabolism, the metabolism of other species, changing the whole environment in which we live in. Or whether you would broaden the understanding of it to include, for instance, the ways in which the industry has been mimicking and displacing and sometimes distorting metabolism to develop technological practices. I mean, for instance, the ways in which pharmaceutical companies copied the biochemistry of steroids to make hormones in massive ways.
Thank you. I would actually take it even one step further. So the case of arsenicals take a lot more detail, but if you look in the historical documents about what people thought it was that they were doing when they were giving low-dose arsenicals to animals, they had an idea that they were actually directly reaching into metabolic processes such that they were suppressing some kinds of metabolic cycles and augmenting others, particularly ones to do with fat deposition, and also interacting with hormonal systems that were controlling metabolism at different life stages. And so they understood themselves actually to be reaching directly into metabolism and making it move faster so that birds reached maturity faster, for example. We could quarrel with whether they were correct or not in that. But in the larger sense, when I speak of the industrialization of metabolism and say that we need to have it as an additional rubric in addition to industrialization of farming or mechanization of crop gathering or spraying, I mean it really super literally, that we were bringing enzymes, for example, out of the bacterial and fungal cells that they resided in and putting them in catalytic columns in factories. So there is this bringing of metabolic elements and processes, not just mimicking them, but literally the processes into configurations that we can only call industrial. They were parts of continuous process manufacturing that were dedicated to mass production. And it's true for pharmaceuticals, but it's also true for other more mundane parts of the food system.
Like hello, high fructose corn syrup, right?
Yes, just like that.
Gruya, you're next.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I have actually a question. As your story was a U.S.-American story, so to what extent can we see a similar dynamic, for instance, in the European Union, which has this reputation of the European Commission in particular, actually looking very closely of what is permitted and what is not. So have you seen a similar usage in the European countries? If you looked at that, of course, and how does it differ in its approach? Thank you.
So if we're, again, to take the story of the arsenicals, it's a very different trajectory in that the European countries and then the European Union very wisely decided that it was not a good idea. Whether or not you were going to use these studies from the 50s and 60s that demonstrated safety or not, it was not a good idea. So this kind of use of arsenicals in the European Union was never allowed. It was never used. But that doesn't mean that the general rubric does not apply. So we can look at the question of the mobilization, let's say, of enzymes in Europe and see that Denmark is a center for that kind of extraction of enzymatic power from some organisms and applying it to the fluids and substances from other organisms, like really taking things apart and putting them together in an industrial configuration. We can see, for example, that the production of methionine, which is an essential amino acid that is a key bottleneck nutrient for the feeding of animals, the synthetic production, so the production from petrochemical precursors of methionine, is centered in France. So after World War II. So there are many ways in which the industrial landscape, the industrial chemical and biochemical landscape of Europe is doing exactly what the Americans are doing. I know that it's kind of appealing to look at America and say that crazy place, it's doing these things, that its food is terrible, all of those things. But I'm afraid that this kind of framework through which we can understand what is happening, in which things are not just being scaled up, a kind of farming is being, but actually the nature of harvesting, let's say, is being transformed through this kind of technical harnessing of different aspects of life systems. That is as true in Europe as it is in the United States.
Thank you so much, Hannah. That was really fantastic. And we're going to move on now to Sadi Lalou, who is director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Paris. And he's also chair in social psychology in the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science at London School of Economics. He has had a varied career, having worked as a senior executive in industry and government, as well as being an academic, and has led several national social science research programs on food, and is currently the co-PI of the Food Socioscope at the Institute for Advanced Study. Sadi.
Thank you very much, Angela. Thank you all for inviting me. I didn't write anything in that book, but it's a great book, and I'm going to tell you why and why you should read it. It's a very detailed, documented, and balanced description of cases where the food industry cooperation with the chemical industry created health issues and how then tried to address them with the participation of science. How this happened, how this has developed, and how this was or not resolved. And so this is a book about the process of regulation and how science intervenes in it. And thank you for the introduction, Angela, and then asking me to be here. But I should give a little bit of disclosure that actually I've been up to my neck in those processes. I was indeed for 12 years chair of the social science committees of national research programs, but I also was I founded the French Observatory of Food Consumption that was designed precisely to assess the impact of chemical ingestion and food on health. I set up a series of things. I was also a part of the scientific committee set up by the French Department of Health to choose the front of pack labeling system that the Nutri-Score in France. And I was actually accused in the first page of the journal Le Monde of having conflicts of interest because I was in several scientific advisory boards of industry. So I read with great interest, not all, but several chapters of that book. And well, it teaches us a lot. I mean, regulation is often thought about as being about power struggles, right? But as a matter of fact, behind regulation, there's also the issue of understanding the system to be regulated and the stakes. And for this, stakeholders need a valid representation of the system, and this is where science intervenes. Science, as a matter of fact, has replaced previous systems like the leader's whim and then religion as the process by which we inform decisions of regulation. And then, of course, decisions are also influenced by the economic and political interest of the stakeholders, and that is the point where the power struggles intervene. But this is a complex process, and it takes time. It involves notions such as transaction cost, path dependency, competition, oligopoly, jurisprudence, and all these are fascinating concepts for economists and lawyers, and they've been modeled actually rather simply in the literature. And the good thing with the book is that it focuses on the role of science here in that process. And science usually takes the heat in those controversies because science is the referee of the power struggle nowadays. But of course, science itself has its own interests, and the book is open about this. And I really, as someone who's been an insider, I love the way the book provides balanced analysis because that really resonates with my own experience of such cases. It turns out that, the media tend to simplify the situation between victims and villains, but the situation is far more complex. Nobody is initially coming with evil intentions. Rather, they come with self-interests. And the devil is usually in the detail. And one major problem is that we discover the negative externalities only ex post. And so when the problem occurs, the system is already developed and participants are not keen to lose their vested interest. And that's true for all parties, but of course, especially true for the industry, which has usually massive vested interest and therefore inertia. And I think that having with this book a look at the detail of regulation construction is a welcome antidote to this simplistic way the mass media treat the problem. And it's also food for thought to those who try to model these issues. And so those chapters will be a wealth of references with concrete details for anyone studying food systems, controversies, and the development of science. And I will use it myself. And And I must disclose also that indeed the food socioscope, this big project that we have with Helga Novotny, we're leading a project that aims at understanding the systemic transition in the food chain and towards more sustainability. And that's a project where, well, we're currently collecting 600 cases worldwide. We collect thick data with interviews, videos on the field, currently already 19 countries. We interview, we film operations of initiatives in the food chain towards more sustainability, and that includes all kinds of agents, from small farms to large corporations, retail, transformation industry, and also, and that's my point here, also municipalities, agencies, unions, etc., involved in regulation. And the point I would like to make here is that while most economists, for example, are usually interested in individual agents at lower level and think that equilibria emerge from some kind of emergence of the interaction of these agents, what happens is that there are mesostructures that facilitate the systemic regulation and the evolution of the system. And these mesostructures have not been given enough attention in science while they're essential. Mesostructures are the place where the emergence of compromise and institutions are created. They are an intermediary, a processing body between knowledge and power in a way. And you know that institutions in the modern sense of the term fix the set of behaviors that are expected from actors. And I think the book is a great resource to understand better how these mesostructures intervene into defining these behaviors and the acceptable limits of those, which we call regulations, right? And so institutions are there to capitalize on previous or distant experience to anticipate the consequences of a behavior. And that's why they are mesostructures. I mean, not microstructures. They have extension in time and in space. And because they have extension in time and in space, you know they will be still there to enforce the rule in the future and somewhere else. And that's the power of institutions. And so they are there to make durable the result of power struggles and to avoid this struggle to be renewed continuously for and so they spare a lot of transaction costs in a way. And for that, they set up not only regulations, but what I would call installations that include material infrastructure, and also they train embodied competences in the agents. And it's the combination of regulation and material affordances and embodied competencies that sort of channel what the behaviors of the agents are. And for example, the AIMS test that you describe in your chapter, Angela, is one of these such installations. And with this example and many others, we can see in the book the way things happen in the real world, which is much more complex than the models that we make in the economic literature, for example. And I don't want to use too much time, but I don't know where I am exactly. But if I got one or two more minutes, I think that the way the examples detail the evolution in time, I mean, is very important because it shows the path dependencies of these decisions, right? And they may not look immediately rational or the best, but path dependency and of course the power struggles explain a lot of what happens is observable at a given moment. And we must understand that there is a natural series of contradictions within any kind of system, and what in organizational theory you call cross constraints, right? And so the whole issue of regulation or management is precisely to find some kind of a balanced compromise, something that is tenable for all stakeholders. I mean, there are very classic issues such as more production creates more damage because the production creates negative externalities and these kinds of things. And precisely what do we do? How do we do when these negative externalities are discovered ex post with a situation where people already have vested interests, but also have been victims, right, of this situation. And then this becomes not only a scientific issue, but it's an economic issue, and it's a moral issue. And this is precisely the kind of things that are described in this book. And I will stop here for the sake of time. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much, Sadi. That was great. And we have time again for a few questions or comments. If anybody would like to jump in, just raise your hand, or you can also put a question or comment in the chat if you wish.
Well, some of you desperately try to find what kind of question you could ask. My feeling, if there is a fruitful direction for research, that would be really to study these mesostructures, right? This is a bit of not a blind spot, but there's a lot of things to know there and how they work.
Jean-Paul has a question, but you need to unmute yourself, Jean-Paul.
I don't know whether it's a real question or a remark, but I was struck by what you said about the fact that dangers and risks are discovered ex post always, and the way this is somehow challenged by cases and histories which insist on what Angela mentioned in the introduction, which is this discussion about the production of ignorance.
Well,
because one of the tacit line of an analysis which is associated with studies of ignorance or of undone science, and so is that, well, the ex post discovery may be a fact, but it's not a law or something which is inscribed in the inevitability of poor knowledge, undone science, and so forth. So that there is a kind of suggestion that here it could have been different otherwise.
You're quite right, right? So indeed, I should not have said discovered, but I would rather say proved, right? Because this is a trial, you know, and so indeed, the production of ignorance tries to obfuscate and slow that proof, maybe not the discovery. But the alternative, you know, is the principle of precaution, and it's a great idea. But we know that precisely because of the absence of proof, we have difficulties. It would take us very far. The problem is that the way we tend to take decisions now is by having some kind of economic valuation, right, of things. What would be the cost of you know, the damage? And perhaps this is not the direction we should continue into, because we've seen that it doesn't work. Maybe we should rather rely on principles rather than costs, and maybe we should try to rely on consensus methods rather than on votes. I mean, there are alternatives, but they're quite a minority at the moment. And the reason why there are a minority is that, as I said, there are interests, but politics and science also have their own interest in that system. And so it would be naive to think that in the whole process of regulation, you only have a proof of whether this is good or bad in terms of health, for example. It's much more complex than that, because there's a game of actors, and so there is literature on this. I mean, Latour, etc. And I think it would be and Angela is actually among others. I know her more because, of course, she is now at the Paris Institute of Advanced Study, Paris, not Princeton. This in the book you have a lot of and may I be allowed again to show this. You have a lot of food for thought and for your papers to show exactly how these things happen, because again, the devil is in the detail.
So you definitely answered the question in the chat, which was about the precautionary principle. So that was really nicely done, Sadi. And I would just mention one other thing, which is that as you talk about the post facto discoveries of problems, there is this kind of lag theory that is the idea that law has to somehow always be catching up with the science, because the science is also changing. But one of the things I learned who contributed to the book and is a scholar of food regulation. He has a wonderful chapter on the food drug line, is that understanding of the law, as if it's somehow naively always catching up, doesn't reflect the fact that often the implementation of statutes and the adoption of certain kinds of requirements and the, not other kinds of requirements is an agreement that industry likes because it's stable. And so the law is functioning often, even when we see it as obsolete. And I think you're pointing to also the fact that there are many parties that have settled on certain kinds of arrangements, and those arrangements in the end aren't always good especially for the environment, but sometimes also for consumers. So, okay, with that, we will go to our next speaker, who is also a fellow with me at the Institute for Advanced Study in Paris this year, Mathilde Cohen. She's the George Williamson Crawford Professor of Law at the University of Connecticut, and her research focuses on courts, decision-making, and embodied phenomena such as eating and lactation, and works at the intersection of legal scholarship and the social sciences. Mathilde.
Everybody, it's wonderful to be here. Thanks for the invitation. I loved reading the book and I haven't contributed to it, but if I did, my chapter would probably be titled Risk at the Breast, Lactation, Health, and the Environment. So I'll focus my remarks on human milk, and I already see some of you rolling their eyes. Human milk, how is that related? Well, human milk is not a fluid which we typically think of as food, but it is actually humans' primary food and the only food that is produced specifically to be eaten by human bodies. And why do I want to speak about human milk here? Because it is both universal. Most humans have had human milk. And it is also a food that is designed for some of the most vulnerable among us, but it's also the least regulated food in circulation, especially for toxicity. And yet, human milk is toxic. It's actually quite toxic, and we've known that for a while. So starting in the 40s, the presence of synthetic chemicals such as DDT, bisphenol A, heavy metals, pesticides has been documented. And we also know that toxic chemicals lodge in adipose tissues. And then to secrete milk, lactating people mobilize their lifetime fat stores, transmitting a portion of environmental contaminants to their bodies. And actually, the older you are when you lactate, the more you potentially contaminate your baby. And this has actually led an American pediatrician, Ruth Lawrence, to say that the easiest way to measure contaminants in our environment is through human milk. And a US epidemiologist, Walter Rogan, wrote in the 90s, I am quoting him here, that if human milk were regulated like formula, it would violate Food and Drug Administration action levels of poisonous or deleterious substances in food and could not be sold. And that was in the 90s. So why is this a problem? Well, infant humans are at the top of the food chain. Compared to their body weight, they ingest huge amounts of human milk, and it's also the only source for their nutrition for their first 6 months of life. And so as I said, the most vulnerable amongst us are maybe subject to the highest amounts of toxins of any organism. And they're basically completely unprotected. So here, echoing Lucas's Mueller's beautiful chapter, there are large disparities in terms of who's most exposed to toxic human milk, because certain groups are more susceptible to environmental pollutants, be it due to occupational exposure. So here I'm thinking about, for example, migrant farm workers, who are in constant contact with pesticides, or because of your way of life. So, for example, the indigenous nation, the Mohawk, who relies on fish for their subsistence, has launched a study and a movement many years ago to show how many of their members' human milk was much more heavily polluted than the rest of the population. And from a regulatory perspective, the lack of regulation of human milk toxicity is fascinating because often historians of law claim that modern regulation is driven by children's welfare. So that historian Linda Gordon had a famous article in 2008 called "The Perils of Innocence, or What's Wrong with Putting Children First." And the article was about how modern American regulation, especially in terms of consumer protection, but also torts, was usually driven by this what she calls putting children's first agendas. So, and she, as he says, one of the most transcultural markers of what historians call modernity has been the prioritizing of children's welfare. So how can we explain that human milk is one of the most dangerous foods and also one of the most unregulated ones? So I have a few hypotheses. I'm sure you have others. So the most obvious is there's this fear of undermining breastfeeding, right? Most public health officials, most children's advocates want to promote breastfeeding, and so everybody is terrified of talking about it for fear of people from breastfeeding. But more fundamentally, I think there's also the gendered cultural construction of human milk as non-food, as a bodily fluid, and more than a bodily fluid, as a relationship, as a sacred bond between a mother and a baby, as a pure and natural milk. So it's conceived as a private, intimate product, not as a food product. And yet, women are the first environment for children. Women are farmers and farm products. So in a way, they are agricultural products. And I think third and most importantly, recognizing the toxicity of human milk is overwhelming and paralyzing because it would force us to face the fact that we have become toxic, that our own bodies are unsafe, and that we've made collective decisions that mean that, again, the most vulnerable amongst us are subject to the harmful effects of our way of living. So we're much more comfortable addressing issues of personal responsibilities by telling, pregnant and lactating people, don't eat this, don't eat fish, etc. And to tie this in with some of the themes in the book, in a way, we're stuck with human milk. We're stuck between two opposite scenarios that would be catastrophic from a regulatory and policy perspective. So one is the aims-like shift. So just like aims to say, well, everything is carcinogenic, everything is toxic, human milk is toxic, so let's do nothing about it, which in a way is our current predicament. Or if we take this seriously, then the scale of the change that's needed to address the problem is just not even, conceptually understandable. So is there a path forward, and is regulation the solution? So we're actually at a juncture because human milk has been unregulated for most, in most legal systems. But currently, the WHO is working on human milk guidelines. Here we're talking about the circulation of human milk outside of human bodies. Of course, we're not talking about intruding in a lactation relationship between parents and children. The United States has been trying to regulate milk, but the US Congress, as you know, it's hard to pass anything. The European Union just adopted a new substance of origin regulation that applies to human milk. And so all of these regulatory projects are all about milk safety, testing for HIV, testing for bacteria. None of these regulators are addressing environmental contamination, toxicity. So again, we're seeing in the present this focus on individual responsibility, on things we think we can manage instead of addressing the bigger picture issues. And instead of taking this as an opportunity to really reassess our way of living, and it would be very easy to not enter into breastfeeding skepticism by regulating this, for example, by highlighting that cow's milk contamination is itself a major source of human milk contamination. So it's not like the solution if it's for everybody to turn to infant formula. So I really think that the risks of intervening in this space are not always well conceived, and they could be mitigated in many ways. And so to conclude, I think we here have a very classic area of feminist over regulation dilemma. The feminist movement has often been torn about do people need more regulation to protect them, or is regulation a way to control them in ways that are problematic? And I think here, and as in other fields, there would be smart ways to use the law to empower people rather than to continue with the current situation and make us even more toxic. Thank you.
That was really amazing, Mathilde. And I think your final dilemma is regulation a way to protect babies or control women really gets at a lot of the conundrums around food. Again, we have a few minutes for questions. So would anybody like to ask a question or make a comment? Yes, Zach.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. And I really think it's interesting that the idea of is human milk thought of as a food in terms of regulation. One of the things I was listening to that reminded me of a theme that I learned working on this book project with the others is kind of the way that status quo bias works as a kind of unstated baseline of acceptable risk in a lot of these stories. And then often, ironically, that baseline shifts over time. And so I'm thinking about your project here. It's almost like we understand human milk in a certain way, but we ignore the way that environmental contaminants are changing. And so therefore, actually, human milk is changing. And so I just want to sort of signal that as something. When I was listening to describe it, I was thinking about that as something I saw in a lot of the projects. And it was a theme I think that this book highlights really well. Looking at the sort of history of a subject instead of just a kind of snapshot. You see how people say, for example, generally recognized as safe because we've always been doing it. It starts as the kind of baseline, even as actually it's shifting. And then also our standards of what's safe is shifting over time. And then it's often really hard to unwind that, later to say, wait a second, we now have a different idea of what's safe. And therefore, even like in the case of nursing a child, what's considered to be a traditional and therefore acceptable risk, actually we should rethink of and reconceive. So I just wanted to sort of point that out as something I heard in your project, but I think resonates with a lot of the chapters in the book.
I love the idea of human breast milk as grass, as generally recognized as safe. And yeah, go ahead, Mathilde.
Thank you. Yeah, I love this too. And Zach, to tie this discussion up with some of your fabulous work, shout out, on your food labels, which is fantastic. a few human milk banks have been working on a human milk label, nutrition label, which is so interesting. I'm so interested in how we turn our own bodies into commodities, for example, by producing freeze-dried human milk. And how would we label ourselves? How would we, what would we have proposals for nutrition labels for the placenta. And what's interesting to me is that we're stressing lactating people by telling them, oh, you should analyze the milk, make sure there are enough lipids, enough proteins, enough of this, enough of that. But no one is, analyzing their milk for toxicity. Maybe it's for the better because we would all freak out and cry all day. But to me, there's also the food label could have a sort of emancipatory potential if used in a better way.
Yeah, just to piggyback on your comment there, and I think Klaus Kirchele covers this better, but one thing you're getting at that I think is also important is the compartmentalization of regulation. And I've really noticed this in language because in English, we just have a difference between food safety and not food risk, I'm forgetting that, food security. But I think you're picking up on the fact that people can get really focused on communicable diseases and food as a vector of pathogens and ignore it as a kind of vector for chemical contaminants. So anyway, that compartmentalization is a kind of interesting feature too.
Great. Jean-Paul.
Yes, thank you, Matt. It was really fascinating to include human milk into this discussion of industrial food or industrialized food in some ways. Can you tell us a little bit about the ways in which you see the timeline in this story? When I say the timeline, I mean, when do you think that human milk has become toxic? So, because there is a timeline involved in the book, which is very much a timeline about the changes in the regulatory landscape, in the critique of the massive use of chemical, of industrialization, and so on. And somehow human milk was taken into that as well. I mean, I'm thinking here of the Nestle scandal and the boycott, which was associated with it, and so forth. But I really like to know about your vision of the other side of the story, which is not the regulatory timeline, but the one about the contamination of human milk and how the two interact in some ways or not.
Thank you. So it's hard to pinpoint directly because different countries maybe have, and in different locales in different countries, the contamination may be different and it was not necessarily measured. So it's hard to compare, but let me tell you what I know that let's pick France because, we're based in France right now. So the year the Ministry of Environment was created, 1971, is also the year a group of scientists for the first time, that's the first time I found in the archives, were tasked with measuring human milk contamination. And so they picked milk from 10 urban areas in France and were absolutely shocked to see that it was above the contamination rate set by the WHO for cow's milk. And so they immediately started informing the French authorities. And since 1971, periodically, scientists often connected to INRAE have been testing human milk with similar and worse results, and nothing has ever been done. So that's the French story.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you again. That was a really fascinating addition to all the things on the table.